Welcome back. In this video, we will have a look at the floating action button as well as some other buttons that we can use in Flutter. So I've started a new project and I've just created a material app, created the stateful widget or stateless widget called My App that we run directly from My App. We return a material app. We have a main page that's a stateful widget and that has got a scaffold with a center and a column as the body. So as part of the scaffold, there's also something called a floating action button. So I'm going to use that property, floating action button. Now for a floating action button, there's a class actually called floating action button, so it's quite easy to do. So just note that now from Flutter 2.2.0, it looks a bit different because we have got null safety built into every single application that you start from now. The default application is a null safe application. So that's why normally you would see this in yellow underline and now it's actually in red. So we need to provide what we need to provide for the floating action button. Okay, so we can see that there they say the name parameter onPressed is required, but there's no corresponding argument. So obviously, if you're going to use the floating action button, you will need to have your onPressed there. So we can just keep it as a normal onPressed with an anonymous function there. And you can see right from the start, the floating action button is already on the screen, although there's nothing on it. So let's just style it a bit more. So for the floating action button, you can have a child. Now, if you hover over the child, you can see the child is a widget. Just note the question mark there, which means it's a nullable widget. So it can contain null, and that's why it didn't give us a problem when we did not specify it. Okay, so for the child, normally what we do is just to show a simple icon there. So I'm going to use, let's say, icons.save, and let's save it and see, and you can see there's the save button now, or the save icon on the button. And you can see it acts like a button. It's got some animation when you click on it. Now we can also set the elevation for this action button or floating action button. So you can maybe make it 10 to give it a bit more of a shadow, so it seems a bit higher on the screen. And then we can do some interesting things like changing the shape of this. But before we get there, also as part of the scaffold for the floating action button, there's also a floating button or floating action button location. And if you go to the floating button or floating action button location and you put the dot there, you can see there is different locations where you can actually put this floating action button. For example, center docked. We'll put it in the center and it's docked, so it's at the bottom. And some people use this with a bottom bar or bottom navigation. So it's center docked. There's center float. Center float will just give it a bit more space at the bottom. So you can go up and play around also with the floating action button location. They suggest that we do not use more than one floating action button per screen. So in this case, for this scaffold, there's only one floating action button location because you should only use one floating action button. And that is normally for something that you primarily do on this specific page. Maybe it is to add a new person or something, and this page will then help you to quickly get to the add button to add a new person or add something new. So make sure that your floating action button does make sense for the page that you're on. Don't just put a floating action button there because you can. Right, so then there's also some other properties that we can set for the floating action button. You can hover over it and you can see there's a lot you can play around with. For example, the splash color. And the splash colors, if you hold down on it, it's that grayish color that comes through there. That's your splash color, so you can go and change the splash color, for example, the hover color. Obviously, if you're on a web page or something else, then the hover color will come into effect. There's a Euro tag. We will do animations a bit later on, but it works also nicely with the Euro animation. There's a background color for it. So you can set all of these type of settings. So for example, we can set the background color there, and we can go to colors dot, let's say red, and we save it, and now you've got a red action button. You can see there's foreground color. So the foreground color, there's different ways to do this, but you can set the foreground colors, let's say colors dot blue, and we go with a shade of 200. So you can see I'm changing the icon's color. So you could have done that also inside of the icon itself. But just be reminded that this one will override, your icon will override this back or this foreground color. So I can set the color to colors.white again, and it will override this one. So you can either set the icon's color by yourself, but that will then override your foreground color. Okay, and then you can go through and you can see there's one that says mini also, which is currently false. So if you want to have a smaller type of floating action button, then you can use the mini one. So it's just a bit smaller. It's default as false. So you can go and change it to true. So the default is false. So you won't have mini false. That's the default. But in any case, if I save it now, you'll get the bigger button again. Also then, as part of this, you can also change the shape. So it depends on, you can also go and create your own shapes. But one shape that we've been looking at is the rounded rectangle border. And for the rounded rectangle border, if I save now, you can see it becomes a rectangle. So as we've seen also, we can change the border radius also for a rounded rectangle border, which means I can go and say border radius dot circular, for example, and I can have, let's say, a circular value of 20 there, or radius of 20, and now it's a rectangle, but it's got rounded corners. So you can go and play around with this. You're also able to create your own type of shape so that your button looks really weird. So you can go and look into that on how to create your own shape that you can use here by using a shape border. And then just to see also that this on press actually works, we can have something like, let's say, a string text at the top, and we can say nothing clicked. And then we can go into, let's say, maybe having a simple text widget there inside of the body, and the body will just show, or the text will just show that text. Let's save that one. Let's just rerun it quickly. Okay, so I see nothing click there at the top. So for this column, let's just make the main axis alignment. Let's make that center as well. And we'll get it inside of the center. Okay, so on that text widget, so when we get into the on pressed, we can call set state. And I'm going to change that text to, let's say, floating, or just call it FAB, floating action button clicked, and let's save that one. So if we click then on it, FAB clicked. So you can see that it can handle that on pressed also. Right, so this is the basics then of your floating action button. As part of your floating action button, you can also use a named constructor. So the named constructor can also be using extended there. So I can say instead of just floating action button, I can use floating action button dot extended. Now extended, there's no mini option, so I'm going to remove the mini option there. And if you hover over this, you will see instead of a child, we've got two widgets there called an icon and a label. So let's change this child to an icon, and let's save again. Let me just check this one. You can see the parameter also label is required. So we've got the icon there, and let's add the label also. And the label, if you hover over it, is a widget, and it's required. You must have it. So we're just going to use a text widget for the label, and let's use the text as save. And if I save that now, or this one could be add. Let's save it again. So we can see there we've got an extended floating action button where we can have an icon at the beginning and then at the end some text. Again, if you want to change the colors there, you can use the background color and the foreground color, but you can also go to the specific widgets and change the colors for the specific widgets. Okay, and that is basically all for your floating action button. You will also see that you can get a lot of packages on pub.dev where people has gone and created some interesting looking floating action buttons, so you can also have a look at that. But this is the basics for a normal floating action button. Okay, so let's go into the center, into the column, and let's look at a few buttons that we can use in Flutter. So I'm going to use a size box here just to get some space between this component. Let's give it a height of, let's make it 40. And then just below that, we will look at a few buttons that we can get in Flutter or that we can use. So the first one is an elevated button. And you can see for an elevated button, we need to provide the onPressed and we need to provide a child. So let's just quickly remove these, put the comma at the end, and let's look at this one quickly. So you can see for an elevated button, there needs to be a function, or there can be, it's nullable, a function on long press. There's also a function that's also nullable called on press. This is on long press, but this one is required, which means we need to have on press there. There's also a button style, there's a focus node, there's autofocus, there's clip behavior, and there's a child, and the child can be any type of widget. So for this, we need to have the onPressed. So for the onPressed, you can just wait for this one to pop up and choose the one that you would like. In our case, maybe we can just use the set state here. And when it gets clicked, we can just change that text to elevated button clicked. And then just end that off. So the onPressed must be there. And then the other property that must be there is the child. And then you can see the problem goes away. So for the child for this elevated button, maybe we can add a row in here. So obviously, if you only want text on the button, you can start with a text widget. If you only want to have an icon on the button, you can start with the icon. But if you want more, you can go with a row or with a column or whatever you want to do. So normally for a button, a row works best. So let's get into some children there for the row. So for this elevated button, if I save now, you'll see that the button actually spans the whole screen now. You can see there's the button. Okay, so on this row then, we will need to go and make the main axis size to a minimum value. Okay, so that's then a smaller button and contains its children basically. Okay, so for this row then, inside of the children, we can, for example, add an icon, and we can use icons dot, let's go with the save this time. So the icon can be a save button, and then we can have a text widget that will just say save. So if we save this now, you can see you've got something similar than the extended floating action button. But now it's not floating. It's a normal elevated button. So it seems a bit, it's got a shadow around it, so it seems elevated. Okay, and then maybe you want some space in between those two components, so you can use a sized box. You can also use some padding or whatever you want to create some space between the components. So I'm going to set the height, not the height. Let's set the width there to a 10, maybe too far. Let's make it a 5. Okay, so this could then be your save button, and when it gets clicked, it says elevated button clicked. This one, FAB clicked, elevated button clicked. Right, so what if you want to go and change the colors? How would we do that? So if you look at your elevated button, there's no color that you can actually change here, but you can see there's a button style. So we're going to use that style to style the button. So we're going to use style there, and in order to style this, we're going to go to the elevated button, and on that class we call style from. And if you hover over style from, you can see there's a lot of styling now that you can set. You can have a shadow color, you can have the primary color there, and so forth. So you can have a look at also the text style where you can set the color for the text. But remember, you can also set it here. Okay, so for this style from then, we can set the primary color as colors dot, let's say red, for example. Or let's make this one a purple and save. And now you can see we changed the color for the button. Then you can see there's also an on primary. So let's change that one also. So let's say on primary, and we go with colors dot, let's say blue there, just to see stand out there. If you save it, you can see the on primary is basically the color on the background. So that's the foreground color. I don't know why they call it on primary. So if you want to change all of those to a specific color, then this is the way to go. But remember, you can go and individually change these colors by going into the icon and going into the text widget. But then these colors, this text and icon widgets, their own colors will override these. And then as part of this style also, you can set the elevation for this button. So if you want to have it a bigger shadow there, like a 40 or something, you can see there it creates a bigger shadow around it. So you can go and play around with the elevation also. Right, so that's it basically just for your elevated button. So it looks like this. A click event actually works nice on all of these buttons. Okay, so now after the elevated button, let's just add a sized box again there. And let's set the height to just maybe a 20, just to get some space there. Okay, so after the size box, let's look at another type of button, and the button is called a text button. Now, a text button, you can actually style to start looking like this one as well, but try and use the buttons for what they're made for. So you'll see the text button takes in a function on pressed, which is required. It's got an on long press that's not required. It's got a style again, like we did with the previous button. It's got clip behavior, and then it's got a widget. And you can see it creates a text button. So what is a text button? It's a button without an icon, actually. So let's just quickly have a look at this one. So on pressed will be just your normal function again, and maybe again we can go and say set state there, and we change the text to text button. Right, so now in order to get rid of this error, we need to provide a child. So actually here you can see that the child can again be a widget, which means I can actually go and add a row there if I wanted, the same as we did there. But your text button, you will see now, looks a bit different now. So we can go and say, let's say an OK button or something like that, and save it. And you can see it's basically just a piece of text there. But if you click on it and you hold in, you can see it acts still like a button. But it's more like just clicking a link or something. So it's like a text, just a normal text button, and that's why they call it a text button. You don't really want to have a background around it and so forth. But you are fully allowed to go and change the style by just going to text button dot style from, and you've got the same properties that we had previously. You can set the primary, the on surface, the background color, the shadow color, the elevation. All of that you can still set with your text button. But just remember that a text button looks like this. So if you wanted to use something else, then maybe you should have gone with a normal elevated button. Right, let's carry on. Right, so let's look at the following one. The next one that we're going to have a look at, let's just have the sized box again there so we can create some space. And let's place it there. Okay, so after this one, we will look at something that we call a button bar. Now, a button bar is basically like a row of buttons. So you will see that your button bar acts like a row in the sense that it's got a main axis alignment, it's got a main axis size, it's got children like a normal row. So it's basically a row. So let's just go to the children there, but it's a row that will basically just contain buttons. Okay, so for this button bar, you can see that we can supply the children. And for the children, you can have buttons in there, but children is widgets, which means that any widget will actually work here. But because it's a button bar, we will place buttons as children here. So let's use a text button, for example, as the first one. And for this text button, we will have the on pressed. And let's set this one state to text button in button bar clicked. Right, then obviously also for your text button, you will need a child. Let's have a text widget there that will just say no. Now if we save it, you can see the button bars to the right, so we'll change that now. So there's the first child, it's a text button. Let's make the next one an elevated button. Just remove those, place the comma. Let's use the on pressed there. For the on pressed, let's set the state and let's set the text to something like elevated button in button bar. Right, then for the elevated button, we will need to have a child. And for this child, I'm just going to use a normal text widget and I'm going to say yes. So if I save this now, you can see that I've got a no and I've got a yes directly next to each other. So now for the button bar, we can maybe go and change the, so I don't see a main axis alignment because it's just got one axis. So I think it's just called alignment. So you're going to go to alignment and that is main axis alignment dot center, for example, and then you've got it in the center of the screen or wherever you want to place it. So you can see no, text button in button bar clicked, and this one. So it's just a helpful widget to actually get your buttons nicely spaced inside of a row. Right, so maybe you want to use a row there instead of a button bar, which would have worked just as well. But the button bar is just a basic widget to help you get widgets in a row, or in this case, buttons in a row. Right, so the last thing I'm going to look at is the material button. So the material button has got a lot of styling that you can have a look at. So if you hover over it, you can see that the material button has got a lot of properties. So this is also if you want to start creating your own button from scratch and you want to go and look at something totally different. Okay, so I'm just going to create a simple button with this material button class. And you can see if you hover over it, if you go to the bottom, we need to have the on pressed, and that's basically all we need. So I'm going to add the on pressed there, and then you can see the error goes away. So I'm going to say set state again. Let's set the text to material button clicked. And if I save it now, yeah, we can basically see nothing, but there it is. Okay, so if it gets clicked, the material button gets clicked. Okay, so now for this material button, we can have, for example, a child. So the child there, if you hover over it, you can see it's just a widget, non-nullable widget. Okay, but it's not required. So let's just use a normal text widget there, and we'll set the text as enter or something like that. And then for that text widget, you can go and style it. Obviously, you can use a text style, you can use Google Fonts or whatever you want, and we can maybe set the color to colors.white. And if we save, obviously you cannot see the text yet. Okay, so we need to have a background there. So the background color, just set the color there as colors dot, let's say deep orange. And there we've got our enter button. You can see a normal button then. We can also style the sides to be rounded like this. So if you wanted to do that, we can go into the shape, and the shape again can be a rounded rectangle border where we have the border radius as border radius dot circular, and you can add your rounded corners for your button. All right, so we can also add some border around it. And in order to do that, we will also need to go into the rounded rectangle border. And for the rounded rectangle border, there's also a side property. And for the side property, you can use a border side, the border side class. And inside of this class, you can set the color, or for this property of this class, we can set, or for this widget, we can set the color. And I'm going to go with colors dot, let's make it white so we can clearly see it. Normally you won't make it white, but if we save now, you can see there's some white border. So let's just make this something else. Let's make it a purple. Okay, so there's a purple border around it. And if you want to change the thickness of that border, you can use the width property. So let's make the width a 10 and save it. So that's a bit too big. Let's make it a 2. And you can see the purple border around it. So if you need a button where you can style a lot, then I think go with the material button, because you can really create and style it as you want. That's it for buttons in Flutter. Hope you've learned a lot from this video. See you in the next one.